History does repeat itself. So that's been always throughout history a major reason why you have had creation of money to finance government expenditures. But we've added another reason in these days, and that's allegedly to promote full employment. In the post-war world, after World War II, every country in the West has had a full employment policy, which means not that we've had full employment. On the contrary, as you know, we've been having increasing unemployment in recent years. But that every time, for quite a period, there was a threat of unemployment or unemployment started to rise, there was a strong tendency by government to say, we've got to do something about this. We have to print more money. We have to spend more money. We have to stimulate the economy. The result of which has been to create an increased quantity of money that in the first instance has had some favorable effects on employment, but only temporarily, only so long as you could fool the people. And then, when people got on to what was going on, it came out in the form of inflation. In the United States, we've also had, and in most countries, a third, less important factor that has contributed to excessive increases in the quantity of money. And that has been mistaken policies by the central bank. Professor Segan referred to the mistake of the Federal Reserve Bank in the late 20s, early 30s. From 1929 to 1933, the quantity of money in the United States went down by a third. And that was a major factor that produced the catastrophe. That was a great mistake of the Federal Reserve. It learned from that mistake. Government agencies, like people, don't always make the same mistake the next time, they make a different one. And since that period, the central banks have tended to make the mistake in the opposite direction. Their mistake has almost always been caused by confusing their function, by thinking that they had something to do with interest rates, instead of recognizing that their real function was to control the quantity of money. Now, most of you will be inclined to say, well, that's all very well, but aren't there some important things you've left out? Of course, the most obvious thing you would have told me I left out was trade union behavior. But I hope I've already persuaded you that that's not a fundamental source of inflation. Trade unions may do a great deal of harm in a great many ways. Trade unions have done Britain enormous harm, but they are not responsible for Britain's inflation. Higher wages are in the main a consequence of inflation and not a cause of it. And as I say, the examples of these charts I gave you before, I hope, will show that anybody who thinks that's a fundamental cause of inflation had better pause for a bit. But there are two other factors that people are inclined to cite. One is to say, what about international influences? The government is particularly fond of citing this, say, oh, well, you mustn't blame us for inflation. We've imported it from abroad. There's a worldwide inflation, and how can you expect the United States to stay clear of inflation if all the rest of the countries of the world are inflating? Now, that was a valid explanation before 1971, when we had a worldwide system of fixed exchange rates. In that case, it is true that inflation in one country would tend to spill over into another because it would influence the quantity of money. In that case, it was inflation in America that produced in the United States that produced inflation in many countries around the world, because their currencies were linked through a fixed exchange rate with ours. But today, that explanation is not valid. As long as countries have variable, floating, flexible exchange rates between their currencies, inflation is a national phenomenon and not an international phenomenon. And the proof of that is very simple. If inflation is a worldwide phenomenon, inflation is a worldwide phenomenon, but it's not an international phenomenon. You know, in every country of the world, you have too high taxes. But high taxation is not an international phenomenon. It's just that all the nations of the world do it at the same time. In the same way, you have inflation in many countries. But if it were an international phenomenon, how come it's roughly 0 to 1% in Switzerland, 4 to 5 or 6% in Germany, 10% in France, 18% in Great Britain, maybe higher than that in Italy, and so on down the line? No, inflation is a national phenomenon produced by monetary policy and other policies within the countries. Now, the second argument that will be made, you've left out of this picture productivity. In those charts, what was it that I connected with prices? It was not simply the quantity of money, it was the quantity of money per unit of output. And it's true. Anything that increases output will tend to hold down prices. And so it's very common for people to say, well, the real source of inflation is that our productivity has not been increasing as much as it should. Or to say that the real cure for inflation is to increase productivity. Now, productivity is an enormously important phenomenon. From the point of view of our standard of life, of how well we live, there's nothing that's more important. If we can get a rate of real growth of 3% instead of 2%, that will make a great difference over a period of time. And I don't doubt that one of our national problems is a fall off in the growth and productivity. But from the point of view of inflation, it's the wrong order of magnitude. It would be a tremendous achievement to raise the average rate of growth of real output in this country from 3% a year to 4% a year. That would be a 33.33% increase. It would be a dramatic change. But it would reduce the rate of inflation by 1 percentage point a year. And from that point of view, the possible variations in the quantity of money are much greater than the variations in output and productivity. So from the point of view of inflation, productivity is very much of a bit actor on the stage. The lead, the hero or the villain, as you wish it, is not productivity, but what happens to the quantity of money. Now, so much for the cause of inflation. It's very easy to say what the cure is. There's no problem how to stop inflation. That's the easiest thing in the world to say. In order to stop inflation, you have to have the government spend less and print less. That's the only way you're going to stop inflation. That's the one and only cure. But you know, the real problem isn't to know how to cure inflation. The real problem is to have the political will to do so. If I may go back to my medical analogy, some years ago my physician told me about a young man who was a patient of his who had a debilitating disease, as a result of which his fingers were threatening to fall off, his toes were threatening to fall off. And my physician said, you know, that young man could be cured in no time. The only thing he has to do to be cured is to stop smoking. But I cannot in any way bring him to stop smoking. He refuses to do it. Now, the disease was curable in one sense, but it was not easy to do it. An analogy that in some ways is much closer to the problem of inflation. It's a very literal analogy, but also something of a medical analogy, is alcoholism. The thing about alcoholism is that when you go out on a toot, the good effects come first, and the bad effects only come the next morning when you have the hangover. Now that's exactly the way it is with inflation. When you start inflating, the good effects come first. After all, the government's printing money, everybody thinks he's richer, he's got all these pieces of paper. And initially it does have that effect. It makes business good, it expands output. It's only after a while, when it works its way through to inflation, that the bad effects come later, and you then have inflation. Similarly, on the other side, the great problem in curing an alcoholic is that the bad effects come first, And the good effects come later when you try to cure it. If a man who has been subject to a craving for alcohol goes off the wagon, it's terrible. He's got a terrible time getting rid of his craving. But if he once can succeed in doing so, everything will be fine. It's exactly the same thing with inflation. If you succeed in slowing down inflation, you will initially have some very difficult times. Just as inflating stimulates the economy temporarily, so slowing down inflation slows down the economy temporarily. A more direct reason why it's difficult to apply the cure is because it's not so clear that people want to stop inflation. If I ask people, are you in favor of inflation or not? Everybody's against inflation. But when I explore a little bit further, if I say to people, tell me, have you gained from inflation? Oh no, you say. I haven't gained. And yet the fact is that a great many people have gained from inflation. There are many, many people who have benefited. Of course, the major gainer from inflation is the Federal Treasury, as I've already said. But almost everybody who has bought a home in the past 30 years has gained from inflation. He was able to borrow on a mortgage, which inflation has paid off along with paying off the government debt. So that almost all homeowners in this country are beneficiaries from inflation. Indeed, one of the things that makes inflation such a bad social disease is precisely that it tends to be divisive. Because some people do very well during an inflation period, and some people do very badly. And as a result, the population gets split into people who are seeming in great prosperity and people who are in great distress. When most people say they want to stop inflation, what they mean is that they want the prices of the things they buy to go down and the prices of the things they sell to go up. But since what one man sells is what another man buys, that's a neat trick if you can do it. And as a result, people aren't really serious when they say they want to stop inflation. Certainly not in the early stages, not before they fully understand, not before it's gotten to the point where it is really creating serious social problems. Everybody wants to stop inflation at somebody else's expense. Now, I've already said that if you start to cure inflation, you will get some bad effects first. Let me emphasize that those bad effects are not themselves a cure. They are side effects of a cure. If you have your appendix out, if you go to a doctor and say, and he says you have appendicitis, you've got to take your appendix out. But after your appendix is out, you'll have to stay in bed. It used to be 2 weeks, now it's 10 minutes. But you'll have to stay in bed for a little bit. And you say to him, well, you know, I think I'll just stay in bed and not have the operation. That isn't going to cure you. And in the same way, unemployment is not a cure for inflation. I can tell you 100 ways to create unemployment that will produce more inflation, not less. I may say that used to be a proposition that people found it difficult to understand. But the experience of the past 10 years or so has done a great deal to make people understand that it's perfectly possible to have unemployment and inflation go along simultaneously. In fact, we've coined some ugly new words like stagflation and slumpflation to try to explain this phenomenon. Well, I shouldn't say to explain it, to name it. So unemployment is not a cure for inflation, but it is an almost inevitable side effect of an effective cure. Now, why should that be? Why is it that there seems to be no way to cure inflation without going through at least a temporary period of relatively slow growth and relatively high unemployment? The answer is fundamentally because of the time delays between the turning of the printing press and the ultimate effects on output and on prices. Both ways you produce the same result. Look on the upgrade. Suppose the government first prints money and spends it to pay for its expenses. To begin with, the people who find themselves doing better business don't know what the explanation is. Government is paying more money, its employees have better salaries, they're coming to the store and buying more goods. The storekeeper is delighted to sell them at the same prices as before. Each man thinks this is something special happening to him. The shoe manufacturer says, look, I can sell more shoes. The demand for shoes is going up. He doesn't recognize that what's really happening is the demand is going up everywhere. And then not only is the demand for shoes going up, but he's going to have to pay more to get labor. He's going to have to pay more to get leather. He's going to have to pay more to produce his product. But when that shows up, when after a while he finds out that his costs are up, then he suddenly discovers that he has to raise his prices to make both ends meet. And that's why, on the average in the United States over the past 100 years, an increase in the quantity of money has taken about 5 or 6 months to affect people's spending. The first thing that happened is people just have bigger bank accounts. Then it takes them a little while to realize that, and they start spending it. And then it's another 12 to 18 months before that works through into prices. So on the average, over the past 100 years, and in Britain it's been for 200 years, I say 100 years because that's as far back as our data go in the United States, there's been about a 2-year interval between a more rapid increase in the quantity of money on the one hand and the inflationary effects of it on the other. But the same thing happens the other way. If the government slows down its spending, in the first instance, people simply experience that as slower demand for their products, and they tend to retrench. They tend to say, well, my inventories are going up, I better cut back production. It's only after a considerable interval that that's reflected in lower prices or in a slower rate of increase in prices and works its way through. So there is no way that I know to avoid the interim effect of slowing down inflation.